Okay, so hello guys, welcome for another episode of our video about the physics class wherein we have to discuss now about dynamics. So first, before we proceed, we have to differentiate what is kinematics versus dynamics. So we know in the previous discussion about kinematics, wherein it is a language for describing motion of an object, which includes its position, velocity, and acceleration, but there was no consideration of what might influence that motion. This time, if we will be considering dynamics, this study causes motion. So the causes of motion, I mean. So the two main factors we need to consider to answer the questions about why the motion of the object will change are the forces acting on an object and the mass of the object. So we begin our study of dynamics by discussing the three basic laws of motion, which deals with the forces and masses, where that these laws were introduced to us and was formulated by Isaac Newton. So the laws of motion, these are physical laws that are the foundation of the classical mechanics, describing the relationship between massive bodies and interaction of forces. And according to Sir Isaac Newton, there are three laws governing motion. So we have three laws of motion or Newton's law of motion. First law is the law of inertia, wherein every object in a stable of uniform motion tends to remain in that state of motion unless an external force is applied. So when the vector sum or resultant of forces acting on a body is equal to to zero, the body will remain at rest. If it's initially at rest or remains in motion along a straight line if it's initially in motion. So ang gina-emphasize ni is that so ma-remain at rest lang specific ni mga body of consideration. So unless may ma-act nga force sa specific nga body nga gina-consider naton or probably naka-state diri kung nag-move siya in motion along a straight line ang aton nga body nga gina-consider, hindi siya mag-change in the direction unless otherwise may ma-act sa iyang specific nga force. That is the first law of motion or the law of inertia. So if the acceleration of an object that can be modeled as a particle is zero, the object is said to be in equilibrium. A body in equilibrium is a body that is either at rest or a body that is moving at uniform velocity. So ara siya sa equilibrium kung it is at rest or constant ang iyang acceleration or uniform I mean ang iyang acceleration. Mathematically, the net force acting on the object should be equal to zero. So dapat imong summation of forces along x and y axis should be equal to zero. So we have to consider what is inertia and mass. So inertia, that is the tendency sa aton nga object to resist any attempt to change its velocity. So mass naman, kabalo kita that this is the property of an object that specifies how much resistance an object exhibits to change in its velocity. So the measure of inertia of an object is um, what we consider as mass. So second law of motion is the law of force and acceleration. So the force exerted on an object is directly dependent on its mass and is inversely dependent on its acceleration. Any object under the second law has an unbalanced force which results to an acceleration. So the direction of object is the same as the direction of the force, mathematically represented as your summation of forces is equals to ma. So amo nga ito nga representation of your second law of Newton's. Second law of motion in Newton. For the third law of motion, so we are aware of this one that we have the law of action and reaction, wherein it states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So between any two bodies, so exerting force on each other, the force exerted by one body on the other body, so is always of the same magnitude but in the opposite direction to be exerted to the force exerted by the body on body For example, B on body A. So for example, you have duha ka object. For example, kung ano nga force ang gina-exert sa imong previous or sa una nga body to the another object, for example. So same man na nga intensity or same man na nga values ng force ang gina-exert sa another body to the first one. So that is your law of action and reaction. So we have to consider the following basic concepts before kita mag-dwell with the different problems nga i-discuss natin. So number one, we have forces. We are aware of this one. Medyo na-discuss na natin in the previous discussion videos. So forces, any interaction between objects which when unopposed to a result to a change in motion. So, force, basta makatupa siya sa specific object kung hindi siya pagbunggan or wala sang opposition sa iya, makakause siya motion sa specific natin ng object of consideration. It is defined as either a push or a pull exerted on a body. It is expressed as Newton in the metric system. So we have two types of forces. Number one, contact force. These are interactions between objects that involve physical contact. So, silingon, may ara kaging physical contact sa, for example, applied nga mga forces or ikaw gid mismo ang nag-apply sina or mga frictional forces along sa imo object kag sa surface kung sa diin siya ga-move. So, for example, dere we have for when a coiled spring is pulled, so there is a force. As a figure in A, the spring stretches when a stationary cart is pulled. So, as in figure B. So, ari kung inbutong mo, may force man dara. When a football is kicked, para sa figure C, so it is both deformed and set in motion. These situations are all example of a class of forces called contact forces. So, tanan, may ari isang physical or nga interaction, physical contact between sa pag-apply ari sa nag-apply sang forces kag sa specific nga object nga nag-cause ang motion or nag-cause ang forces. So there are also mga non-contact forces nga pwede natin i-consider. So also called field nga mga forces. So attracts or repels from one distance or through empty space without physical contact na required. So examples ni mga magnetic force, gravitational force, so wala ka kita dira may makita ng physical contact but still it affects sa ato nga body in consideration. So example, sino yung gravitational force? So electric force, mga muna nga mga forces. So and mga forces governing sa aton nga mga particles or sa aton nga mga electrons and protons sa aton nga mga gina-consider nga mga elements. Next, another consideration we have is the difference between mass and weight. So mass is the amount of matter contained in the body. A scalar quantity remains constant wherever it is. Ang weight naman, that is the force na siya due to gravity. So that's why we are considering nga gina-multiply natin ang aton nga mass to gravity in order to acquire the value of weight. So take note that weight is always pointing downward. So bisan ano pa bisan ano pa nga surface ang ginaga niya. So okay, we have horizontal, straight lang. We have inclined pero ang weight mo Japon downward lang. So bisan amo pa na yung mga surface diri sa piak but you have weight nga downward lang sa gihapon ang iyang representation. So the direction of weight is downward no matter what the orientation of the object is. The mass of a person is the same whether he is on Earth or on the moon. So take note of that one. But ang iyang weight may vary depending on his location. That's why the person is not fat or heavy, but he is just in a wrong planet. So pwede nga mag-change ang imong weight, pero ang imong mass will be the same lang. Kay dependent niya sa gravity ang imong weight. Another nga kinahanglan naton mangin aware of is the tension. Tension is the pulling, stretching, force acting from the opposite ends applied actually through the strings, cables, or ropes. Basta may string ka na, may ara ka na tensile force. So, basta may string, ropes, may amo na may tensile force ganda. Next, we have your compression force. So balance inward force on a material or structure. It occurs when a physical force presses inward on an object, causing it to become compacted. So, ari ang compression, do medyo suli siya sang tension. Ang tension kapag wa ang compression kapasulod ng force. So that is compression and tension. Next one, normal force. So, NF na siya ngayong symbol sa iba ng mga books. So, and frictional force, ang symbol niya na small letter F. So, whenever two forces is in contact, move or tend to move past each other, the two forces will always exert two force on each other. Number one, we have frictional force. This is happening kung may ara sang interaction between surfaces. So a force resisting the relative motion between the surface always present whenever a body is in contact with the surface, whether the body is moving or not. So, bisan gagiyuman na siya, ginabutong man siya or wala, ga-move man siya or wala, basta in contact with a certain surface, may ara talaga gina-consider nga frictional force. So, frictional force. Always opposite the direction of motion or impending motion is always parallel to the surface of contact. Okay? Always parallel. So, imbis pa kadto ka for example sa right, ang motion sa imo or ang sign, representation sa imo mga frictional force is pabalik, opposite kada permi. Next, normal force. Support force exerted upon an object that is in contact with another object. So, note for some books, normal force is denoted as N, but for this module, gamiton tang NF will be used so as not to be confused with the units ng Newton. So, we have two types of friction. So, number one, based on the motional relation between surfaces in contact. Number one, may ara kita static friction or FS. Buti-lingon, ang ari static, by the word ng static, it acts when the motion is just impending or when there is no relative motion. So static, buti-lingon, stable, no motion involved. So kung ara pa siya before pa lang mag-start ang motion, so that is your static friction. Pero kung nakagiyo na siya, there is motion involved. So it acts when one or both the surface are in motion. So that is already a kinetic friction. So just a reminder lang for a normal force. Ang normal force is the opposite siya or this one acts perpendicular sa imo nga body kag sa surface. So ang surface mo for example horizontal ang imong normal force pa mo na. Basta dapat perpendicular siya sa imong surface. Next, we have your coefficient of friction. So the ratio between the force required to move one surface over another and the pressure between surfaces depends on the surface in contact and are nearly independent of the area of the contact. So take note of the formula. We have F all over your normal force. Friction all over normal force. So coefficient of static friction or your mu s. So, the ratio na siya sang static, syempre, kag normal force, so, Fs ang sa babaw. For the kinetic friction na, so, F sub K na ang sa babaw. So, ang mo lang man i-consider natin whether kinetic siya or static friction. Next, free body diagram. So maghambal ta free body diagram, we were able to do this previous natin ng mga discussion video. We are representing sa specific nga body through a figure para masapos aton mag-analyze. So a diagram representing all forces acting on a body in a question isolated from the other parts of a system. This construction is an integral part of analysis of a system using Newton's laws of motion. So medyo para mapahapos nato ang pag-analyze ng specific na problem. So steps in illustrating an FBD, choose one object and draw an arrow to represent each forces acting on it. So kung ano mo na nga body, so dra tam start, then draw sa tanan-tanan yung mga forces nga nag-act on a specific nga body. If the problem involves more than one object, a separate free body diagram is needed for each object. So for example, may duwa ka boxes mga muna connected sila by rope. So, dapat may duwa ka free body diagram, one for another body, one for the other body. We consider for now the likely forces that could be acting are gravity and contact forces. One object pushing or pulling another and the normal force kag mga friction nga niga act on a specific na body. So, This is a simple introduction of the concept we will be discussing on the Newton's law of motion. So we are going to present this one para mas maintindihan through examples in the next discussion video. So thank you. Stay safe. God bless.